Thankful that you are here as well. This thing is going to give me fits, I've got a feeling. But we're going to continue with the series that we've had ongoing since the beginning of the year, having to do with discipleship and asking the question what it means to be a true believer and how being a true believer is going to impact us in a lot of different areas of our lives. We've looked at several already in the last few weeks, some of which we might consider ourselves strong in. Others we may consider ourselves doing okay in, but always in need of some work. The one we're going to talk about today is one that on a local level, on an individual basis, we may be functioning fine. Everything may be working to plan. Everybody may be getting along. But I believe that when I tell you what we're going to be talking about, you will agree with me that on a societal level, we are in a crisis. And the only way that we're going to be able to deliver ourselves or be delivered from this crisis is by recommitting ourselves as a society and emphasizing the principles as a society of discipleship. And the area that we're going to talk about today, where discipleship is going to drastically improve our way of lives, is in the home. The home. There is no greater area in our lives where we are facing greater challenges and greater threats and greater dangers than we are facing in our homes. And I don't have to tell you that. You are experiencing these dangers and these challenges and these threats as much as anybody else in our world. But I believe there's a design behind that. I believe there's a reason why we're facing the challenges and the threats and the dangers that we're facing in our homes, and that's this. Satan knows that the home serves in many, many respects as the foundation of our very society. He knows that. And so He has calculated a way that He can impact society on a greater level by attacking us on a lesser level. And the way that He has chose to do that is to impact the fabric of our society. He's chosen simply to impact the fibers of our home. He knows that if He can do something that will destroy the foundation of marriage, for instance, then that's going to open the door to so many different things. And it has. You attack society on the basis of marriage. You destroy the foundation of marriage. And what comes? The onslaught of promiscuity, the onslaught of homosexuality, and so many other dangers and threats and challenges that are facing the foundation of marriage. He knows that if He can destroy the foundation of parenting, that He can have a greater impact in developing generations that are morally blind, that approach life through an entitlement mentality, who are self-consuming, and who are disrespectful. He knows that if He can minimize and persuade us to call the biblical roles for the home archaic, that He can build a society that is rebellious and dysfunctional. And you know, the sad reality of everything that I just said is that none of it is hypothetical, is it? It's not hypothetical when we say that if you destroy the foundation of marriage, that you open the door to the onslaught of promiscuity and homosexuality. It's not hypothetical to say that if you can destroy the foundation of parenting, that you are developing or going to develop generations who are morally blind and entitled and disrespectful and self-consuming. It's not hypothetical for us to say that when you minimize the biblical roles of each person in the home, that you develop homes and a society that are dysfunctional and rebellious. None of that is hypothetical, because those are all challenges and threats and dangers that we are experiencing right now. That we are experiencing in our society to pieces. And so we stop and we just simply have to ask ourselves, with all of these dangers and threats and challenges that we are facing, what in the world can possibly be the answer? What is it that can help bring us back from the precipice of the inevitable fall that we will experience? And my answer, biblically speaking, would be a commitment to discipleship. You know, many would assume that the answer to that question, the answer to the challenges and the consequences that we're facing as a society because of the downfall of the home, would be to simply refocus our efforts on strengthening the home inherently. By that I mean this. Many people would assume that to face the challenges that men are facing in view of being better husbands and being better fathers, that they simply need to give more attention inherently to being better husbands and better fathers. Or for ladies who are facing challenges in being better wives and better mothers, that all they need to do is refocus their attention on being inherently better wives and better mothers. Or for children to be better children, they just need to refocus their efforts on inherently being better children. The problem that I see with that approach is this. When we see weakness in the home, and we focus inherently just on those weaknesses, what are we essentially doing? We're treating the symptoms of a much greater disease, but we're doing nothing to touch the disease itself. When men are facing a crisis in how to approach their responsibilities as husbands and as fathers, it's not just because they don't grasp the idea of what it means to be a husband and father. When women are having a crisis in view of their responsibilities as wives and mothers, it's not just because they don't grasp the necessity, the responsibility that they have as a wife and as a mother. When children are facing a crisis in their formative years, in being the children they're supposed to be, it's not because necessarily they have just inherently not gotten what it means to be a child. It's the symptom of a greater problem. And so a man who fails as a husband or father, he hasn't just failed in being a husband or father. The failing as a husband or failing as a father is just simply the symptom of the greater disease, which is he has failed to be a true disciple of Jesus. When a woman fails as a mother or as a wife, they haven't just failed as a mother or a wife. Those are just the symptoms of the greater disease because they failed in being a true disciple of Jesus. A child that fails has not just failed in being a child. They failed in being a true disciple of Jesus. And that's because a home will only succeed as a home when every participant in that home chooses to follow God's instructions for how that home is to function. A man can only be a better husband and a better father when he is truly committed to discipleship. When he is truly committed to following the instructions that God has given to him on how to govern and direct his life. A woman can only be a better mother and wife when she commits herself to discipleship and serving God's interest in her life. Children can only be better children to their parents when they commit themselves to true discipleship and the expectations that God has given to them to live and to govern in their lives. And so it takes a willingness to commit oneself to God's expectations, sacrificing to see that they are done, and humbling themselves under divine authority. Now, do those three things sound familiar? Because those are the three qualities of discipleship that we've emphasized every single week: commitment and sacrifice and humility. And it's only when a person willingly commits themselves to God's expectations and sacrifices to see them done and humbles themselves under His divine authority that men, we can be better husbands and fathers. That women, you can be better wives and mothers. That young people, you can be better children. In other words, the success of the home is directly connected to our willingness to be true disciples. And that's because when we strive toward true discipleship, we learn some things that are essential toward the success of the home. And there's three that I want us to talk about today. We'll talk about one or two this morning, and we'll finish up with the other one or two this afternoon. Number one, in order to strengthen and improve the home as God would have it to be, we need to learn a lesson that discipleship can teach us in view of respect. Homes where respect reigns are homes that succeed. But you know, that respect has got to exist and thrive and reign on many levels in the home. And let's talk about them one by one. Men, we must respect our wives and our children enough to be the types of servant leaders that we have been called to be in the home. Do you remember what Paul's instruction to us men was in Ephesians chapter 5? Husbands, love your wives. To what extent, Paul? Even as Christ also loved the church and gave Himself for it. Is there any question whatsoever that Christ is the supreme leader of Christianity? That He is the supreme leader of our lives? Absolutely not. I mean, we call ourselves after His name, right? Christians. But He was a servant leader. And you see that servant leadership in the love that He displayed, Paul said, toward His church, in that He loved it so much He gave Himself for it. A sacrificial love. Not self-serving, not overbearing, not self-centered, but a servant leadership. A sacrificial love. And when Paul instructed men, us, in how we are to function in the home, he likened the leadership that we are to assume in the home to the leadership that Jesus displayed toward His church. And so if we need to see the way that we are to function as leaders in the home, all we have to do is look to the leadership of Jesus. But that requires respect. To be a servant leader. Now, to be a tyrant, to be a dictator, that doesn't take respect for anybody but oneself. A person can be a tyrant or a dictator without any concern whatsoever for those over whom he rules, for those over whom he has authority. But that's not what God has called us to be. That's not what His expectation is. He's called us to be servant leaders, just as was Jesus. And that means respect. Respecting our wives in the way that we lead them. Respecting our children in the way that we lead them. Taking them into consideration in everything that we have to do. And knowing that being a servant leader demands sacrifice. It cost Jesus His own life. And you know, to be the men that we are called to be in the home, it's not out of question that it could cost us ours. Number 2, ladies, the Bible teaches that you must respect your husbands enough to know that as the head of the home, he is not functioning in a self-serving or overbearing manner. Back in Ephesians 5, just before his instruction to the men that we read in verse 25, he said in verses 22 and 24, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands." In what way, Paul? As unto the Lord. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. How do you view your submission to Jesus? Do you view your submission to Jesus to be a submission to one who himself was self-serving or overbearing? One who was himself a dictator or a tyrant? You don't. Because in reading and studying your Bible and in studying about the life of Jesus, you come away with a much different picture about Jesus than that. In fact, I would dare say a person who views Jesus as self-serving and overbearing, tyrannical, and as a dictator is not going to choose to submit their lives to Jesus. But as a disciple, you have. And that's because of the way that you see Jesus portrayed through Scripture. Not as self-serving, not as overbearing, not as tyrannical, not as a mere dictator, but as one who leads you always with your best interest in mind and sacrificially. That's what your husbands have been called to do. And if they are functioning as husbands, as a true disciple, then that's what they are doing. And so for the home to succeed, it, number one, takes a husband, a man, and a father who respects his wife and his children enough to lead them in the way that God instructs. But number two, it requires a wife who is going to respect her husband enough to see how he is functioning and to respect that leadership. Or else the home is simply not going to succeed. And number three, it's going to require children who respect their parents enough to submit their direction, to submit to their direction with the realization that their authority is God-given and that your best interest is what they have in their minds. In Ephesians chapter 6, just a few verses after what we've read already, written to men and to women. In Ephesians 6, you remember that Paul said this to children, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord." Why? Because that authority is God-given. Because it is right. "Honor thy father and thy mother, which is the first commandment with promise." Why? Because they have your best interest in mind, meaning that it may be well with thee and thou mayest live long on the earth. And so if you have a father who is functioning as a true disciple in his fathership, and a mother who is functioning as a true disciple in her mothership, in their respective roles in the home, they are functioning in the Lord, as you see there in Ephesians 6:1. Then for that home to succeed, Paul says it takes children learning to respect their parents in that way. To respect their parents, number one, in the realization that the authority that they have in the home is not one that they've just assumed. It's an authority that God has given to them and has always given to parents in the home. You go all the way back to the beginning of time, and parents had authority in the home. You read Moses' discourse in Deuteronomy chapter 6 about how parents were to function in teaching and guiding and directing and training their children in the ancient days. And that has gone virtually unchanged. Parents still function in the very same way because the authority that they have has been given to them by God. But number two, it takes children respecting their parents and submitting to them with realization that for better or for worse, whether it makes you happy or not, whether you get to do what you want to do or not, whether you always agree or you don't, that whatever decision your parents make in your upbringing, they make, if they are functioning as true disciples, they make with your best interest at heart. They make those decisions not lightly, not flippantly, but prayerfully and with great thought, and likely from a wealth of personal experience themselves. And I know adults, you think back to your childhood and the perspective that you brought. We're going to talk about that perspective more this afternoon. But you think about the perspective from which you came as a child, as a young person, and in the decisions that your parents made. But now you have the benefit of looking back in retrospect and how those decisions played out. And for better or for worse, what those decisions ultimately led to. And I think back to that often in my life, to decisions my parents made for myself or for my brother, that at the time in my youthful mentality, I didn't appreciate. Because I didn't get to do what I wanted to do, or I didn't get to go where I wanted to go, or I didn't get to buy what I wanted to buy. But now I look back in retrospect and I think they made that decision based on experience and wisdom. And they did it with my best interest in mind. And sometimes it's hard to see that through the lens of your life now. But if you have a father and you have a mother who's functioning as true disciples in the home, in the way that they approach their responsibility as a father and their responsibility as a mother, that for your home to succeed in the way that it can, it takes you respecting your parents enough to submit to their guidance based on those two realities, that their authority is God-given and that they have your best interest at heart. Both principles from Ephesians 6, verses 1 through 3. Now, with all of that said, what does any of that have to do with discipleship, right? What does any of it have to do with discipleship? Well, it has everything to do with discipleship, because I want to quickly go back to each of those three passages that we just read and see that there is a connection in every one of those passages in how our respect for each other in the home models the respect that we have for and that we have learned from God. All right? Number one, go back to Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25. Husbands, how are we to love our wives? Paul said, even as Christ also loved the church and gave Himself for it. Now let me ask you this. As a disciple, do you have a greater understanding of the sacrificial love that Christ has for His church than someone who is not a disciple? You should if you don't. But if you are a true disciple of Jesus Christ, you live with an immense amount of respect and understanding of the sacrificial love that Christ has had for His church and what it led Him to do. And when we, through discipleship, are able to comprehend, at least to the extent that we can, the amount of love that Christ displayed for us on the cross, then we have a greater understanding of how we can emulate that in our marriages. And so that's the connection between discipleship and the respect that a husband must have for his wife and a father must have for his children, and the way that you lead them, because we are, literally speaking, in our leadership of our wives and in the leadership of our children, in the authority that we have in the home, we are simply called to do the very same thing that Christ has done for His church. A mentality that we can greater emulate when we are true disciples. Number 2, in Ephesians 5:22 and 24, wives are to submit to your husbands how? Well, Paul said, as unto the Lord. And therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Now, let me ask you this. In the same way that men who are disciples can have a greater appreciation and understanding of the servant leadership of Jesus and the sacrifice that He made as in view of the church, and therefore gives us the opportunity to emulate that same type of love and sacrifice in our role, is it not the case that as a disciple, ladies, you have the unique experience of knowing what true submission to Jesus is, what it means, what it calls for, what it ultimately can lead to, and therefore, are you not able to emulate that even in a greater way in your relationship with your husband? It's discipleship that teaches us that lesson, men, in how we can be greater leaders, servant leaders. Ladies, it is discipleship that teaches you how you can be greater in the role that you have with your husbands, in that submissive sense. Number 3, in Ephesians chapter 6, children are to obey their parents according to what rationale? The reality of God's love and concern. We didn't read verse number 4, but in Ephesians chapter 6, Paul extended that thought beyond the first 3 verses. He started, of course, by talking about obeying your parents in the Lord, why that's to take place. But in verse 4, he then brings the conversation back around to fathers and says this, fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but nurture them up. In what way? In the chastening and in the admonition of the Lord. Now, the chastening and the admonition of the Lord are simply a reflection of God's love and God's concern. The admonition of the Lord, the chastening of the Lord, the care of the Lord. In other words, children obey their parents under the reality of the godly influence that their parents are trying to have on their lives. And is it not the case, young people, that as disciples you can have a greater appreciation for God's care and for His call for humanity's allegiance to Him, helping you to understand the way in which you are to submit to your father and to your mother. You submit to God based on His love and concern. You submit to your parents, again based on His love and concern, but also based on theirs. And that's a type of respect that discipleship is able to build in our lives. It's a lesson of discipleship, if you will. And so if we could but restore respect in the home, as God originally intended respect to reign, so many problems and dangers and weaknesses that we face would be resolved. And it's discipleship that is able to teach us that type of respect. This afternoon, when we come back at 3, we're going to talk about the other 2 things that discipleship can teach us in view of strengthening our homes and strengthening ourselves as a society, we're going to talk about how that this discipleship can teach us a lesson in prioritizing. And then number 3, we're going to talk about how discipleship can teach us a lesson in view of perspective. And I truly believe that we face a crisis in the home that can be resolved through, biblically speaking, those two realities as well. And so come back at 3 and we will conclude this particular study for today. In Psalm 127 and verse 1, you remember the psalmist that he wrote these familiar words. Except the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain that build it. I take from that passage the fact that the righteous pursuits of any family are going to prove successful when each member of that family have built their lives on Jesus. Because as each member of a family builds their lives on Jesus, then you combine them together into a family, into a home, and what has that home essentially done? They as a home then have built their lives on Jesus. And so I say that to conclude with this reality. When we can get discipleship right, as we have said many times before, when we can get discipleship right in our minds and in our lives, when we can grasp and live what it means to be a true disciple of Jesus, then everything in life, including the way that our homes function, is going to fall into place just as God has intended. But it takes that absolute, unwavering commitment to discipleship. And maybe this morning that's something that has been lacking in your life for whatever reason. Either because of neglect or because of ulterior passion or motive or whatever it is. If there's anything in your life that is keeping you from reaching your greatest potential in being a disciple of Jesus, or has kept you altogether from becoming a disciple of Jesus, friends, that's something that's got to be put in the past, and it's got to be put in the past immediately. The call of the gospel is an urgent call, and God is wanting you to answer it today. If you're here and you're not a child of God, you never become a disciple of Jesus, that's the first step in what can be a lifetime and eternity of blessing. Why not come in faith, believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, turning from your sin in penitence, acknowledging that faith publicly through confession, and being immersed as the Bible teaches, to contact the blood of Jesus that can wash your sins away. Maybe you've done that in the past, but you haven't been as committed to living as a Christian since that time or at some point in the past. And you need to come home. God is still waiting and watching and hoping that you would come. And that includes this morning. If you're an erring child of God in need of returning home, then just do, in many respects, as the prodigal did, come to yourself and realize that life is better at home with the Father. Get up and shake the stink of the pig pen off, turning from whatever sin and negligence is present in your life, and come back and fall down at the feet of God. And He will receive you back, restore to you full sonship, give you the hope that you have been lacking. If you need to come and be a true disciple of Jesus, or rededicate yourself to discipleship and being a child of God, please don't tarry, but do it right now. While together we stand and sing.
Just as I